Hello everyone, I'm Sadiah Qureshi and I'm here on behalf of Creative Manchester and the Department of History here at the University of Manchester to welcome you all to this special event. Thank you so much for being here. Before I begin, there's two brief announcements before we turn over to the conversation. There are no fire alarms scheduled for this evening, so if we hear a fire alarm, please leave as soon as possible and event staff here will guide you out. Secondly, I'd just like to point out we also have another event where Olusoga will be in conversation with Kavita Puri tomorrow about the Bengal famine of 1943, so please do join us for that if you can. And with that, I want to move on. It is my great pleasure to introduce our immensely distinguished speakers and to welcome you all. Firstly, leading the conversation is Professor David Olusoga, who is a broadcaster, writer, presenter, and Professor of Public History here at the University of Manchester, which is our great delight. And you may know him from any number of groundbreaking TV series in recent years, some with accompanying books, including The World's War, Forgotten Soldiers of Empire, Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, Black and British, A Forgotten History, Civilizations, A House Through Time, Union, and most recently for the wonderful new show 1,000 Blows, for which he was executive producer. If you've not seen it, it's wonderful. He's won 2 BAFTAs, with the most recent one a special award in recognition for his services to television. And our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Adam Rutherford.
Who has none of those things.
But he has other things. He is a scientist, a writer and broadcaster. He is a lecturer at UCL, where he teaches genetics, focusing on its history and the cultural and social impacts of biology, particularly in relationship to race and eugenics. He's written 8 books, including the best-selling How to Argue with a Racist, and You Should, and A Brief History of Everyone Who Has Ever Lived. His broadcast career includes writing and presenting award-winning television programs and far too many BBC Radio 4 programs, and more in the works, where he presents the weekly culture show Start the Week. He's the recipient of the Royal Society's David Attenborough Award for Public Engagement in 2022 and was recently awarded the University of London's inaugural School of Advanced Studies Public Humanities Fellowship, which David did the inaugural lecture for fairly recently.
Yeah, he got it first. I was the second.
Oh. But with that tiny violin, I hand you over to our wonderful speakers. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for that introduction, Sadiah. Thank you to Adam for being here. I don't know whether eugenics or the Bengal famine is going to be the most depressing of the subjects we're going to deal with over the next couple of days, but we will find out. But there's no person I'd rather be discussing the subject with than Adam, who I think has written about this from the point of view of a scientist, but of scientist who's become, I'd like to think, an historian. I'm not sure whether he's ready to be conscripted into the ranks of historian. But Adam has that ability as a working scientist to delve into this subject and to understand it and describe it in a way I think nobody else is doing at the moment. So, and it's an important subject to discuss, as we will be getting to, because it's not just an historical issue. It's a subject, it's an area, it's a way of thinking, it's a mindset, and it's a power relationship which is sadly alive and well in the world today. But I thought we should begin by asking, well, what eugenics is, but also what it isn't, because I think it's important to have a definitional framework here.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, both of you. That's ridiculously generous introductions. And some of my best friends are historians, so I don't mind being part of that crew at all. What you said actually is exactly right, and how I think it's really important to frame the concept of eugenics is it is a mode of thinking, and it predates the word itself being coined, which occurs in the 1880s. As far as we can tell, people have been thinking about shaping society, sculpting society through reproductive control. So that's via 2 means. That's either infanticide or by basically arranged marriages. And people have been thinking about this for as long as the records go back in pretty much every culture that has existed on Earth. So it is a mode of thinking which says, well, we see that we're biological, we see that we are capable of changing crops and animals in order to bring out their characteristics that we feel are desirable so that we can eat them or make clothes out of them or whatever. And so why can't we do the same to humans? And we see it in, I think really the earliest robust example is in Republic. In books 5 and 6, Plato talks about annual marriage ceremonies or marriage festivals where gold standard men are matched with gold standard women, and they have gold standard children as a result, similar for silver and bronze. And therefore, the social hierarchy is maintained. And that never happened, of course. That's his utopian dream. But there are plenty of examples from antiquity all around the world where it did happen. I mean, the Spartans are often cited as an example, but we don't...
This is the other form of control. This is with the Spartans. There's both marriage and infanticide.
Yeah, there's a lot of infanticide.
Not that the sources are that reliable.
No, that's exactly right. And I think the Spartans are quite interesting. We'll probably talk about this later, because in the later eugenics movement, there's a real fetishization of classical civilizations, which I think really does persist to this day, particularly amongst men of a certain class who went to certain public schools. And I know it's sort of funny, but it's also really inherent to the birth of the movement in the 19th century. But the Spartans, yes, there's this whole idea that the babies who are weak are drowned, or as they're young children, they're exposed. The only source on that is Plutarch, and that's written hundreds of years later. But we do know from Seneca that people would drown deformed babies or babies with obvious disabilities in the same way that you'd do the same to a flock of sheep, in order to purify the stock. I think I'm going to be using a lot of words which are at best archaic.
If you just imagine that there are air quotes over lots of these words, that's probably going to help us get through.
That would make it much easier for me. Yes. Yeah. So this idea that humans are mutable because we're also part of this pre-evolutionary, but we are subject to change over time. And so it becomes a mindset. You get to the late 18th and to the 19th century, and you've got people like Thomas Malthus who are beginning to describe population growth problems, that you have enormous population growth as a result of industrialization, industrial revolution, and so on. And as a result, he speculated that we'd have these boom and bust cycles because happy populations grow exponentially, but resources grow linearly. Now, I don't think economics is a little bit better than horoscopes in terms of its evidence.
Not quite a science? Or?
I'd say, the dismal science.
The dismal science,
yeah. And I don't think anyone's ever demonstrated whether Malthusian cycles have ever been anywhere based in reality.
Yeah. And he didn't predict crop rotation or fertilizers or world trade.
No, it's funny that, isn't it?
All the things that actually prevented.
Yes, but he did propose that people should have fewer children through abstinence, which of course is a famously ineffective way of not having children. And then that takes us into the Victorian era, and then Darwin happens and demonstrates quite clearly the mutability of species through this process of natural selection and artificial selection as well. And then along comes his half-cousin, Francis Galton.
Let's hold Galton back,
okay,
because he needs a bigger entrance on that. Let's go to his they're half-cousins, aren't they?
Shared a grandfather.
Shared grandfather.
Yeah.
What is the impact, with reference to this way of thinking, this long history of controlling marriage and controlling the production of children, what is the impact of Darwin's ideas on that way of thinking? Because Darwin is not the originator of eugenics, but his work is revolutionary, and there is a Darwinian revolutionary moment, isn't there? Yes,
I think so, and my work. You introduced me as a sort of pseudo historian, which I'm happy to.
I thought you were a working scientist. That's a compliment, I think.
Some of those things are vaguely true. Yeah. I think where I'm really interested, the things I'm really interested in are how primary research in science becomes co-opted into pre-existing political ideologies.
Yeah. And Darwin's is the case.
Yeah, and in fact, the history of scientific racism, which precedes my work on eugenics, is the same story again. You get the emergence of biological classification with people like Linnaeus, using a system that we still use to this day, Homo sapiens. I literally can't think of another species. Boa constrictor.
There we go.
Thank you. The only species where the colloquial name is the same as the... Anyway. So Linnaeus comes up with a taxonomic system for describing all living things. And with that, included in that, is the taxonomic system for describing not just Homo sapiens, our species, but the birth of scientific racism as well. And so there's a strong argument to be made, which is that biology, classification is invented to serve racism. So race is invented to serve racism, to part of the justification for colonial expansion and so on. So what that means is that biology, so the root of this subject that I spent the last 30 years devoted to, the root of that subject is in service of a political ideology. And similarly, the subsection of biology that I spent the last 30 years committed to is genetics, and that emerges out of exactly the same process in the 19th century, which is, here's some new research which shows natural selection and the mutability of species, and it's brilliant, and I think the greatest idea anyone's ever had, and Darwin is the most important thinker that the human species has ever created. But immediately, the ideas get co-opted into the pre-existing mindset, which becomes eugenics, which is we can mold people, we can improve the quality of the stock of the British people.
Darwin speculates, though, doesn't he? There's the first chapter's on animal breeding. He doesn't propose what becomes eugenics, but he does speculate that these ideas are relevant to people. Not
until after eugenics becomes more embedded. So there's no mention of humans in The Origin of Species, which is 1859. Humans are literally...
So 76,
72 is the descent of man. Yeah. And in which he applies evolutionary theory to humans, after writing a couple of books about, vegetable mold and other things in between. And I think it's his more interesting work. Because it's about people, and it's got plenty of established scientific racism in it, and plenty of typical Victorian sexism in it. But it's a broadly humanist, small h humanist, and also in some ways big H humanist book. But I think that it is the misappropriation of those ideas by people whose ideologies are very, very clearly hegemonic and white supremacist, that it takes those ideas and says, well, look, Darwin says this, which means that this is what we should do. And that's ideological.
They don't wait for Darwin to publish in 72. Social Darwinists go from the 1850s and start applying his ideas. And eugenics really emerges from a range of ways of thinking of how can we apply these revolutionary ideas that have emerged from Origin of Species.
Yeah, I think that's right. So Galton is... Mark Twain said that travel is the one way to make people more liberal and less racist. Galton, as a young man, went out and travelled around Africa, Sudan, and the Middle East, and he came back much more racist than
I've read his accounts of travelling around what's now Namibia. It's not a classic gap year. He doesn't broaden his mind enormously.
No, he's a weird guy, an important weird guy. But and I know that we're not in the business of judging our forebears or characters from history. But he was a weird guy for his time.
Yeah.
And was profoundly racist and profoundly white supremacist, and came back from his travels, and he was obsessed with social hierarchies, and he was obsessed with the success of his family. So he comes from this incredible family.
Him and Darwin, that family. I mean, this idea of genius in the Darwin-Galton family, there'd been quite, lightning had struck quite a few times in their family.
Yeah, that's right. So Samuel Galton, his grandfather, was one of the lunar men, and Darwin married his first cousin, who was a Wedgwood. So you've got this, pretty impressive clan of serious people. The Galton branch were Quakers who'd made a lot of money as gunsmiths, and I've never really resolved that. The whole pacifism thing within Quakerism. Anyway, Galton becomes independently wealthy when his dad dies, and he goes off on his travels, and he comes back, and Darwin publishes The Origin of Species, and Galton is enamored with this success of his genius half-cousin. This is, again, minor point of trivia, but I like these bits of history. His comments on the original manuscript of The Origin of Species are that it's a brilliant work, and there's a minor error about rhinoceroses on page 162.
Well, he'd shot rhinoceroses in Southwest Africa.
So he had good knowledge.
Shoot an animal, you know it back to front, I always find.
Yeah, another terrible bit of trivia is that of the two subspecies of gorillas, one is called gorilla subspecies gorilla, which is just silly. And the other one is called gorilla subspecies Beringii, named after the first person to shoot one. We're not going to make it through this hour. No,
we haven't actually got eugenics up and running yet. So we're 10 minutes in. So can we launch eugenics, please?
Yes. So he's obsessed with the question specifically of genius. His first non-travel book is called Hereditary Genius, and it is about how the slightly nebulous concept of genius or great eminence flows through families.
And you've been very critical about his ability to see the value of evidence that he uses in that book, that he takes at face value measures of genius that, when you look into what the actual evidence were, is pretty paper thin.
Yeah, and I think this is a really, really important point, because I think you see a lot of the same behaviors in contemporary tech bros who claim to be very evidence-based. It's just data, right? Here are the numbers. And what Galton was using in order to draw up these new statistical analyses for concepts that had previously been just within the remit of the humanities, he was trying to scienceify these nebulous concepts. And so he's inventing new stats and looking at numbers and saying that this proportion of people are geniuses and this proportion of people are at the other end of the spectrum and so on. But the evidence he's using are obituaries and public profiles in magazines. And you look at that and just go, well, your evidence is literally opinion. I mean, it's the opposite of evidence.
So anecdote becomes data. Something as nebulous as an obituary in a newspaper where
never
written by journalists.
Yeah, no, written in an entirely neutral way. Every public profile has ever been done. And I just think it really, really shows his blindness to the cultural influences and the status he had as a successful rich man in Victorian society. He is oblivious to the inherent bias in the data he's using as an attempt to scienceify and apply statistics to this otherwise nebulous concept. So he's a data bro. He's the original data bro. His mantra was, whenever you can, count. Which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing to do, but it is if it's at the expense of...
Sounds like you're on Sesame Street. Maybe Galton as a Sesame Street, maybe
as the count.
It's him and Galton are the only people who've ever lived by that maxim. I did not see this conversation going in this direction. I've never seen the parallels between the Count and Galton. Now they're clear.
Well, the other thing, we were talking about this earlier, is he was born in Stourbridge in just outside Birmingham. And it really, really does reduce the impact of his significance if you imagine Galton talking with a really thick Brummie accent. I feel like I'm trivializing something really important here.
This is the light bit before we get there.
Well, when you were doing the introduction then, I was thinking the same for both of us. The stuff that we write about and the stuff that we research, it is miserable.
You've noticed.
Yeah, and you get to the end of the day and close your laptop and think, I really need to look at some kittens right now. No, in fact, and this is a true story.
You can find those online.
This is a true story. I said this to David a few years ago, and we've both got dogs. We've both got sight hounds. I've got a whippet, and you've got greyhounds. And I said, at the end of the day, we've been writing about genocide or slavery or eugenics, and at the end of the day, you just want to spend some time with your sight hounds. And you said, the history of sight hounds in Australia is like one of the most racist things that's ever happened.
They were part of the genocide. So,
can't we just have dogs? No, we can't.
This moment with Galton, where he's interested in ideas of genius, that's very inward-looking, but he's also looking, like many people at the time, at what they regarded as the great problem of society, which is that industrialization, urbanization, global trade, the increase in the supply of food, the increase in wages that came with industrialization, that the wrong people seem to be thriving.
Yeah.
And I guess the promise of eugenics is that it not offers an explanation of what's wrong with society in the minds of those who are its advocates, but it also offers solutions.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that's why it's an ideology, not a science. It's taking this idea and saying this is how we fix this perceived problem. And what you just said is exactly right. You need to rank people in order to decide which are the qualities that you want to be maintained and who gets to reproduce and who doesn't. And as soon as you start ranking people, the only question is who gets to choose. And so the soil in which eugenics emerges is Victorian Britain, with waves of immigration from the colonies, expansion of the cities, a much more visible poor.
Huge Irish population after the famines of the 1840s.
Yeah, created by us. And you've got other phenomena like the transfer of the care from the church. There's the repeal of the Tudor Poor Laws and the establishment. There's an enormous number of institutions begin in the 19th century. So institutionalization, transfer to the government, effectively, of care of the people at the bottom end of society. And so, and you've got the sort of formalization of declinism. The thing that I mentioned about this sort of fetishization of classical civilization, I think really takes hold with some of the key players in the late 19th century, because they all are totally wedded to this now, not rejected, but very archaic view of the fall of Rome, the fall.
Because the study of classics, of classical empires, inevitably takes you to the question of why they're not still here.
Yeah, and they've all read Gibbon. Well, I think they've read the front page of Gibbon rather than the full 6 volumes. Has anyone read the full 6 volumes?
I haven't. Yeah. Life is short.
Yeah, quite. And they're all going to. The thing about public schools is not just a political dig, but it is that they go to the classical public schools, the sort of definitional public schools, which are Harrow, Eton, Winchester, and a couple of others. And then they all go to Oxbridge, where at this time you're required to do X and classics. And most of them end up doing maths or natural sciences and classics. And so there's this just reinforced hegemonic structure that says, look at this society which is the light, where there was no social mobility, where people knew their place. And this happens to be supported by the people who in Rome would be like us at the top of society. And the narrative from Gibbon is that that Rome becomes decadent, the middle classes, the middle and ruling classes have too few children because they're prattling around with art and culture and plays and interesting stuff. And while they're not having enough children, the invaders from the east, who are much more fecund and having many more children, charge in, and all of a sudden civilization has ended. And that's the TLDR version of what becomes foundational for eugenics, and I think it's still very present in the current conversations.
Well, I mean, we've had members of the US Senate talking about maintaining civilizations being impossible with other people's babies. I mean, this idea that a failure to reproduce is a threat to the West, is absolutely current in 2025.
Yeah. So when Elon Musk talks about the specific quote, he says that the biggest threat facing advanced, in different quotes, advanced civilization or Western civilization today is not climate change, it's population collapse. And then you look at the numbers and go, well, the global population is not collapsing, right? It continues to accelerate to get, and it'll probably top out at about 9 billion in about 80 years' time. But it is at not replacement levels for certain groups and many developed countries. So at that point, you're going, well, wait a minute. This sounds very, very similar to the arguments being put forward by Galton and Churchill and that German guy who's going to come up later in the conversation.
And the conditions are similar. I mean,
Austrian,
Austrian, yeah. You have a period in which women, the growth of literacy in the 18th and 19th century in Europe is astonishing. Women can read, middle-class women have options, and the birth rate does go down.
Yeah.
And delayed marriage does go down for the middle class, but it doesn't go down for those at the bottom. So you have a society in the middle of the 19th century which has the great example of the fall of Rome, that has its own empire, which it worries about its future and the potential of its fall, and you have, in their mind, the wrong people reproducing. And then you throw Darwin into the mix.
Well, I don't think you throw Darwin into the mix. I think you throw Galton into the mix. Darwin's my guy, and I think he's mostly exonerated from this. He doesn't really participate in a way.
No, I meant his ideas.
Yeah.
Darwinism.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And Galton goes, well, look, we've got a solution to this, and it comes with the authority of science, and not just science, but
you've used the phrase scientification of this moment. So these old ideas that you could improve society by the right people marrying and by the wrong people not marrying or the wrong children not surviving. But this is given the patina of science in this moment in the 1850s, 60s, 70s.
Yeah, and that really is Galton. And it starts with Galton, it's developed by his acolytes, because everyone just goes, oh, well, he's got the answers here. Well, when I say everyone, this is only conversations happening at the top end of society but politicians immediately go, great. We've got this new, robust statistical analyses which says that our ideas are right.
Well, if you think about the appeal of eugenics for a politician, particularly in the 19th century, it not only says that you and your class and your group are the best people, it also says that the problems of society aren't the fact that your policies might be failing or your economics might not be sound. It says the problem is actually the people themselves, that the wrong people are surviving, the wrong people are thriving, that the problem is innate and biological, not political, and something that can be addressed through your actions or your inactions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we call it hereditarianism. So biologists absolutely hate this, but you will all be familiar with nature versus nurture. Those two things are in reference in our now understanding of biology. Nature being innate, which is genetics, and nurture being the environment, which is everything in the universe which isn't genetics, right? And they're not in conflict, which is why we don't say nature versus nurture. A better phrase might be nature via nurture, but it's Galton that comes up with that phrasing, right? So he recognizes that there is the innate and there is the social, and those two things are entwined. But for him, as someone who thinks that genius runs through the male lines in families of composers, poets, politicians, prime ministers, rowers, wrestlers, he doesn't talk about a single woman in Hereditary Genius because he thinks women are just merely vessels for the transfer of our greatness. I say our greatness. Me and you, we are not included in his scheme at all.
I noticed I was absent in the list, but yeah.
But what was I saying? Something about wrestlers.
Can you explain, because obviously one of the most famous things that Galton does is he gives these ideas a new name.
Yeah.
That's a critical thing, but can you sort of talk about how he codifies these ideas to be not just about the genius within families, but also the problem and what we might do about the problem of people at the other end of this equation?
Yeah, okay, that's really good and interesting because as a topic, because I think we tend to associate eugenics now. It's a very toxic word now, but it wasn't then. It was broadly accepted across society and across political divides as well, which we can talk about in a bit. But there is an enormous range of argument about what we should do. And at the extreme end, it is murder and mass sterilization or infanticide. And that does happen, and the pathway that leads to those actions, those murderous actions in the Holocaust, is very much rooted in Galton's ideas. But at the other end, it's sort of pro-natalist policies, which is, tax incentives for middle-class people having more children, which we have. We have child benefit. That is a pro-natalist policy that we have in this country? Is it eugenics? I mean, you asked me at the very beginning what is eugenics and what isn't. And this, for me, is a bit of a problem conversation, because there are plenty of people on the political right and on the pseudoscientific side of these debates today who say, well, the fact that we don't mate randomly, we don't have children with random people. We are very selective about the people that we choose to marry and choose to have families with. So is that eugenics? To which my answer is, I don't care. What are you doing? This is not a semantic argument. If you want the word to be defined in that particular way, then fine, yeah, but that also means that's the last time me and you are going to speak about this.
Because what's missing in that argument is the idea of state control. Yeah,
it is. So I think that's really important, that eugenics, for the useful version of eugenics as a definition for me, is that it is top-down. It is government or hegemonic control of reproduction via various means, some of which are discussed and never enacted. We never had it in the UK. Some of which are discussed and enacted with genocidal consequences, which occurs in multiple countries around the world. So, it's an idea which, the mindset appeals to different political persuasions and different levels of severity within those persuasions.
Because this is not this is seen as a scientific movement that is legitimized, it's been scientified, to use your phrase, but it's not something associated only with left or right. It is something which is broadly, it has advocates across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
To the embarrassment of many on the left today.
Oh, absolutely. So the founders of the Labour movement, the Fabians, Beveridge, keen eugenicists, George Bernard Shaw. So I've got a fun slide on it, which is useless for undergraduates because it has people from the political left, broadly political left and political right, on it who were keen advocates. And one of them, 1912 is a key year for me, and one of them is Churchill, who's then the Home Secretary in the Asquith government, and sort of unrecognisable from the image we see of him, we think of him today. One of them's Arthur Balfour, former Prime Minister at this point. Mary Stopes, best known as the clinics that provide reproductive health for women around the world, for tens of thousands of women around the world. She was one of the most keen, like an absolutely virulent anti-Semite, racist, and actual Nazi who sent love poetry to Hitler in 1938. So, she can't get away with it being, well, we didn't know then. Her interest
1920s love poetry to Hitler's fine.
Yes, well, that's all right. Well, I mean, another example is a love letter from D.H. Lawrence. He didn't actually get off with her, but I'm not sure that's the correct terminology, is it?
You're the scientist.
Okay, well, Lawrence wrote a love letter to a children's author in 1907, I think it was, from memory, in which he fantasizes about a gas killing chamber the size of the Crystal Palace, in which he would go around the back streets of London and round up the sick and the poor and the maimed, and walk them into this killing chamber as big as the Crystal Palace, where they would be softly playing brass bands and a cinematograph, and they would smile him a weary thanks before being executed. I mean, I don't know what your love letters were like when you were a young man, but...
Well, mine's to Hitler, the word.
Right.
Along that line.
We got distracted again. And then there's on the political, you've got people like Virginia Woolf.
There's the Huxleys, the Guardian newspaper that I write for. The Guardian's, one of its lapses in our history has been support in many editorials for the eugenics movement.
That's right, and same with the New Statesman. And And also, it's worth pointing out, it's not just political spectra as well. One of the things that you see anywhere in the world where eugenics is either discussed or enacted is you see the same but regional differences. So in the UK, it's very focused on class, which is, we are a very class-based society, and even more so historically. In America, it's very based on race and immigration. And in Germany, it's very much about medicine.
And your work has been really about those three countries and that trajectory from England to America, then from America to Germany. Just to stay in Britain for a moment before we go, because we've got to take questions in about 25 minutes. In the early 20th century, this is a whole network, this is a whole system of thinking. There are eugenics conferences, there are eugenics books, there's publication. This is a movement that's going somewhere. It doesn't stay in Britain. Britain's been one of the places for the engine rooms for it, but it does start to spread around the world. How does it transmit to America?
Yeah, so it is back to Galton, in fact. So you do have the emergence of these ideas is happening semi-independently in different countries around the world, including America and Germany and a few others, Sweden as well in particular. But you get, again, the sort of ratification of it when Galton's work becomes better known. So, for example, the key figure in American eugenics is a guy called Charles Davenport, who's a biologist, a developmental biologist, like an embryologist, which is actually where my PhD was in. And he visits Galton in the 1890s and comes back to America with a letter of endorsement with this newfound vigor for the sort of scientification of eugenics that Galton has advocated, takes it to America, and basically sets up the whole eugenics movement so from about 1904 onwards. The first foundation is 1907. And America, apart from Nazi Germany, is the country that embraces eugenics the most.
And in America, in certain states, we go, because in Britain this has been a movement. In America, we start seeing this being enacted as policy in certain states.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's a big distinction.
It is a big distinction. You see the first eugenics-type policy before in the late 1890s, which are new state legislation which prevents certain people from getting married. But then it really, really kicks off in 1907, where you see the first state legislation, which is Arizona, which says... which is enforced sterilization of certain groups of people. And this
has gone from an idea to an idea that now has victims. People's lives are being drastically altered by these ideas.
Exactly. So people from 1907 onwards, people deemed unworthy of reproduction by the state are sterilized against their knowledge or will. And it starts in Arizona, and then it just spreads. And over the course of the 20th century, I think it's 31 states, so the majority of US states have eugenic sterilization policies on their bills, on their statutes. And the last of which was repealed in, go on, guess.
I'm worried about them being reinstated at the moment rather than repealed, but I would...
1986.
86.
Yeah. So I've met women who were sterilized against their knowledge, who are alive today, who were victims of eugenics policies in America.
I've met mixed-race Germans sterilized in a similar program, but we'll get to that. Just because this has become state policy and this has become ratified in law doesn't mean that the building of the science stops. I mean, they continue to experiment, they continue to develop these ideas and to codify them.
Yeah, and I think this is really where the genetics comes in, and this is really where, I am a geneticist and I've studied genetics since I was 18.
Because it's important to say these ideas have developed before the mechanisms of genes have been invented.
That's right, that's exactly right. And again, in the same way that I think that Darwin is fully exonerated from the horrors of this story, the figurehead at the beginning of genetics as a science is Gregor Mendel, the Moravian friar, who gives us the rules of inheritance through his amazing studies of peas, breeding 29,000 pea plants together, and shows us that there are units of information that are passed from generation to generation, and they're passed from generation to generation in statistically predictable fashions. And they don't get called genes until the beginning of the 20th century, but he's basically discovered genetics.
So the mechanism by which traits are passed through the generations is now understood.
It's beginning to be understood. I mean, it's a really, really crucial distinction, that as well, because actually, I'm just going to science nerd out here for a second, because I think this is important to me and the two other biologists I can see in the room. One of the reasons that experiment is so brilliant is because Mendel recognizes that the only way you can see the expression of those traits that you remember from GCSE or O-level, the crinkliness of the peas or the colours of the flowers or the height of the stems, the only reason he can see the statistical patterns emerge is if he's already controlled for the basic messiness of genetics, which shows that naturally occurring pea plants don't have these characteristics, or they have continuity in these traits. And he bred out that background in order that the key characteristics
message could come through.
Exactly. And it's a brilliant, brilliant experiment for that exact same reason. Now, what happens from 1900 onwards, which is when Mendel's work gets translated into English, is it happens at exactly the right moment for particularly the American eugenicists to go, oh, well, there are genes for crinkliness of peas, or, petal colours. And humans are, as per Darwin and now Mendel, are organisms. So there must be genes for eye colour, is an obvious one, or skin colour, or seafaringness, or everything. And that's the model that they come up with, because as per Galton, they're hereditarians. So that every behavior, every trait, every behavior, and every disease can be encapsulated in a unit of information which we now call the gene. And if you can do that, you can plot it on a pedigree, on a family tree, and if you can do that, you can say, well, these are the characteristics that we need to breed out of people, or these are the characteristics that we need to breed into people. And that's what they did. So they landed on, at exactly the right moment in history. One of the best experiments in history gives an enormous fillip to this incredibly scientifically illiterate, racist ideology, which they latch onto and say, well, now we know the mechanism, so this is what we should do. And the Americans, they grab hold of. Interestingly, the British eugenicists and biologists, all of whom were at UCL, at my home, they actually reject this completely, because they say the stats don't work. It's too complex, it's more complex than you're accounting for, and we reject this completely. They don't reject it because they think eugenics is bad. They reject it because they think eugenics is good, but the science of the Americans is bad. So the classic example I give, I said eye colour, right? Yeah. Everyone knows that brown eyes are dominant over blue, right? So you've got to have one copy of the brown-eyed gene in order to have brown eyes, or you've got to have two copies of the blue-eyed gene in order to have blue eyes.
That's
right?
what I was taught at school.
That's what everyone is taught at school to this day. It is not true. It's just not true. It's probability of...
Your PhD was in the development of the human eye, wasn't it?
Yeah. We don't know how eye colour works. And I don't mean I don't know that. I mean, we don't know. Not really. Any colour combination in parents can produce any colour combination in children. Eye colour is not binary, right?
Eyes are.
Well, if you've got two...
But not eye colour.
Oh, the one-eyed people. And in fact, that model that we still teach today comes from Davenport, comes from exactly this. And even he recognizes in the original paper, which was published in 1907, he recognizes that eye color is not binary. There's a spectrum of eye colors, and people have different eye colors in the same eye. As you well know, if you've ever looked at anyone else's eyes, and there's a line in that original paper which describes the inheritance pattern of eye color for the first time, which says, people with hazel eyes, we think they're actually blue. Yeah, I'm reading this going, fuck. I mean, it's easy to say bad science because it was old, but this is bad science because it's bad. And really, really designed to reinforce the political idea that they're actually promoting.
And in America, I want to get to how it transforms and mutates in Germany, but in America, you said Britain's obsession I think justifiably was always class. In America's society that is in the last half of the end of the 19th century, 40 years away from a civil war, 40 years away from slavery, there's a generation of African Americans who had been enslaved. They made up 10% of the population. The society that had torn itself apart over a civil war about racial slavery is still a racially segregated society, and eugenics has specific things to say about race.
It certainly does, and you get interesting, significant moments in history at this time, such as the first racialized disease. Actually, not quite, because the first racialized disease is really Tay-Sachs, which is identified in Ashkenazi Jewish families in the 1880s. But you get the establishment of the genetic pattern of sickle cell, which is characterized to this day as a black disease. Now, genetics has shown through the end of the 20th century that black is a kind of a meaningless categorization in genetic terms. Yeah. As a social construct, it's enormously important.
Yeah. Well, I've heard you say this before. I mean, race doesn't exist is both the truest thing you can say scientifically and the most obviously untrue thing you can say socially. And we have to say, we have to be open to say both. It does not exist scientifically, but race as a social construct is extraordinarily powerful.
Yeah. So one of the things that I find useful is to point out that race is not meaningful biologically, but it has enormously important biological consequences, and no more so than in medicine, because society is racially structured, medicine is particularly racially structured, and of course, as everyone knows, poverty is the biggest correlating factor in almost all diseases. And if you live in a society where you're less than one generation away from enslavement, and the descendants of the enslaved are always at the bottom end of society, then lo and behold, you do see the emergence of many more diseases, many of which have a strong genetic component to them, but you see them in particular groups of people associated with poverty and history.
Yeah, and if you're looking at that society, at some people being problematic, spreading problems, spreading diseases, then eugenics as a new prism through which to see this segregated society of hierarchies, of an underclass and an overclass, it's a very helpful way of further framing those divisions.
Yeah, absolutely, because it means it's biological and not social, and it means that even within sort of movements led by people like racial uplift from W.E.B. Du Bois, even he has biological essentialism ideas within his framing of racial uplift, the top 10%.
Because it's seen as modern. It's seen as a scientific approach, and therefore a modern approach to understanding society.
Yeah, and it's always that conflict between nature and nurture which allows this conversation to flourish at any time in history. And it just seems batty to me, because you don't have to be a communist or radical leftist to recognize that we actually know how to solve so many of these problems in very simplistic terms. And I recognize I've already trashed economics today. Sorry if you're an economist, but it's poverty, right? It's the single most heritable characteristic that humans have ever had is money. And I think that, saying that and pointing that out sort of overtly is a little bit head-scratchy, because we associate heritability, we associate heredity just with biology. We inherit stuff. But we inherit genetics, we inherit from our parents. But we inherit everything from everyone. And it doesn't have to be just biological inheritance. Really trivial examples, like you might have genes which predispose you to being an early riser or a night owl, but your partner might be the exact opposite. Now, you can choose to get up early or go to bed late, or the other way around. So the biological impact of your partner is more significant than the biology that you actually have yourself. Now, that's an obviously trivial example, but I think it's a useful way of demonstrating quite how non-deterministic genetics is. But for the eugenicists, it is determinism.
It's the key to history. It makes sense about absolutely everything.
Yeah.
In the American eugenics revolution of the late 19th, early 20th century, it's gone from ideas to policy. People have been sterilized. People's marriages have been declared illegal and invalid. This is also a system that is spreading its ideas, particularly to Germany. And there are people paying, there are people funding for these ideas to be translated into German and made available to German eugenicists.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So you get the birth of the German, they never call it eugenics in Germany, they call it Rassenhygiene, so race hygiene, just like public hygiene protects the people, and personal hygiene protects the individual, race hygiene protects the race. And their equivalent of Davenport and Galton is called Alfred Plurz, who starts off as a teenager. He's a socialist, but he goes to spend a summer on a farm in Iowa, and he comes back so appalled.
That would do it.
Well, it did for him. He talks about the quality of the people there and devotes the rest of his life to Aryan supremacy. And he's also inspired directly by Galton, and he sets up the first eugenics journal and the eugenics club, and he plugs his way through the Weimar years, and the movement grows slowly. The regional differences thing is interesting in Germany as well, because it is heavily focused on disability. And medicine, which has been devalued socially during the Second Reich for complex historical reasons. Many medics see this as a way of improving their social standing, and so get on board with it. But anyway, that's jumping ahead. What we see is, with Plurz and the development of many of the ideas of race hygiene in Germany, you see the Americans latching onto this, and then not just latching onto it, but providing the legal framework. So in the policy, Charles Davenport's second in command in 1920 wrote a book which included boilerplate legal documentation so that states could put sterilization on their bills much quicker. You just change the name of the state, and there it is. And that's the first document, that's the first, so the Nuremberg race laws that come into effect in July 1933 are a translation of that.
And there is educational material, posters, literature, leaflets, which are literally translated word from English to German and made available to the German eugenicists.
Yeah, and in fact, an amazing example of this is one of our least favourite characters from the 20th century literature history is Tom Buchanan from The Great Gatsby, who cites in the first few pages a popular science book that he's read, in which he fantasizes about the white race being extinguished. He says it's all science, it's being proved. Now, the book that he's citing is written by a fictional scientist called Goddard, which is a very unsubtle reference to a book by a man called Stoddard. The book is called The Rising Tide of Colour, and the fictional version is called The Rise of the Coloured Empires. Really not subtle stuff, this. But the introduction to that is written by a guy called Madison Grant. Madison Grant wrote a book in 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race. Hitler read The Passing of the Great Race when he was in prison after the beer putsch, and it's the first book translated from English into German in 1933. Hitler described it as his Bible. Master Race comes from The Great Race, from that. So you've got an American book that's being mocked in Gatsby, which is comically racist. Madison Grant says that, again, the classical civilizations, he says that Rome, Egypt, and Greece, that those great civilizations, were founded by North Aryan people who migrated down there, set up families, and then retreated back to their woodland idylls, having established the classical civilization.
As you would.
As you would. He says that,
and it's full of maps and tables. I mean, it looks
so many tables.
It looks very scientific. It's designed to make you feel that this is carrying the weight of empirical evidence and scientific inquiry.
Yeah, that's right. Madison Grant was a great conservationist, and there is a connection with conservation, the birth of the conservation movement. He founded the Bronx Zoo, which, for those of you who've seen the Madagascar films, is where that's set. He's responsible for rescuing the American beaver from extinction and the caribou. But I think that there's a sort of wild frontier attitude about eugenics in America as well, but it's also that nature we need to preserve nature. We need to preserve these organisms in the wild frontiers of America, and that includes white people. So, I think Madison Grant is the most important writer of the 20th century that most people haven't heard of. But it's Grant and that guy.
This world that emerges, that finds its worst expression in Nazi Germany. We shouldn't think of this as an organic German movement. This is an idea that is given its first form in London with Galton in the middle decades of the 19th century, that becomes law, becomes statute in America, and then spreads and develops into Germany, into what happens. We know what happens in the Third Reich. We have, again, sterilization, but we have sterilization that is programmatic, the T4 program.
Yeah. It starts earlier than that, though, as well.
It starts with the Rhineland bastards.
It does. So that's in the 20s. This is your area.
This is in the 20s. These are the descendants, the children of, for the most part, French African soldiers, but also a few Black American soldiers who'd been in Germany in the occupation of Germany at the end of the First World War, who are isolated. These are teenagers when the Nazis come to power, and they are literally taken out of their schools or taken away from work and taken to facilities and sterilized.
We think it's a sort of 800 in the initial rounds, but it's many more than that later.
The figures keep changing. I don't think we'll ever know, because people didn't talk about it, because it was. And also many people didn't actually know it had happened to them. There are people who discover decades later, having tried to have children, that visit that they barely remember when they were 13, 14 was to be sterilized.
So the idea of miscegenation becomes prominent at this time, which is also heavily derived from America. And there's a time a bit later, which is when, in 1935, when the Nazis are trying to define Jewishness, that they look to sort of genetic patterns of inheritance of Jewishness. And they look to the one-drop rule in the Jim Crow era in America and decide that it's too harsh. It's so, the racism in America, which is supposedly based on a scientific idea, is actually too strict for defining Jewishness in actual Nazi Germany.
Well, the Nazis wanted the get-out clause. They wanted to be able to say, and they say this about some very leading Nazis who were discovered or shown to have Jewish ancestry, that the strength of the Aryan gene had overcome the Jewish gene. They always wanted to be able to declare someone Aryan if they were useful enough or Nazi enough or horrible enough. They always wanted the get-out clause, and the one-drop rule didn't give you that. So it worked if you wanted to segregate formerly enslaved, the descendants of formerly enslaved African Americans. It didn't work if you wanted to create the Third Reich.
I mean, when I hear things like that, I just think it's bafflingly inconsistent, and it makes it so obvious that you're just plucking whatever you can out of wherever you can in order to justify the ideas that you've already got. Alfred Ploetz, the founder of race hygiene in Germany, he argues until about 1927 that Aryan people should miscegenate with Jewish people because they're so successful, they're disproportionately successful. And it's only after Hitler's virulent anti-Semitism, which he gets from Madison Grant, that the rest of the eugenicists in Germany say, well, we should also include the Jews as being, not needing to breed with them. Another thing worth mentioning, which comes directly from the States as well, is it's funded by the Rockefeller Foundation.
It's absolutely, there's money. I mean, this is a purposeful program of transmitting these ideas from one country where they become law to another country where they could become law.
Yeah, and did. Yeah. Rockefeller pulls out in 1938. And the American eugenics movement officially sort of begins to dwindle by this point, partly for political reasons, partly because people are beginning to see that Nazi Germany isn't quite as a pure ideological state as they previously thought. Maybe Hitler's a bad guy. But also partly for just the fact that Charles Davenport and Harry Laughlin were dying. And, the big figurehead. And I think that's super interesting in historical terms, because it's just like you've got a champion behind this, and then when they go, everyone else goes, I'm not sure this was a super good idea in the first place. But it's too late in Germany by that point.
Well, we're trespassing on the time for questions, but I do want to just finish with the last point, because obviously at the end, in 1945, the legitimacy of eugenics is in tatters. Everyone can see where this has led. Everyone can see what this regime really was. And we've talked probably because I'm an historian, we've talked about this as an historical phenomena.
Yeah.
But we're not really in a position to do that, to talk about these ideas as ideas people used to entertain, people used to believe.
Yeah, I think so. I argue that the word becomes toxic. It's not 1945. It's not when the horrors of the Holocaust are revealed. It is in the decades after that, and many of the eugenics labs, where they've done interesting work on inheritance, they become genetics labs. So the political bit of it gets removed, and the scientific work continues. That continues into the 1960s. You get interesting phenomena, which is like journals, which are called. I've got a complete set of the Annals of Eugenics, which starts in 1907, I think it is. And in 1954, the spine simply changes to the Annals of Human Genetics. And I've just submitted a paper to the 100th birthday anniversary, and guess what it's about? This. There's no mention of it. There's no editorial. There's no editorial. There's no mention. We know who the editors were before and after, and it just goes the Annals of Eugenics, and the next issue is called the Annals of Human Genetics. So these things happen unsubtly and slowly. But eventually it emerges, the idea of eugenics becomes just associated with the Holocaust specifically and the horrors of the Second World War, quite rightly so. But the mindset doesn't go away. And I think that, well, I mean, ask us again in 10 years' time or 100 years' time. I think there's good evidence that the political landscape has changed so significantly in the last 20 years that both scientific racism and eugenics are really enjoying a proper renaissance.
Well, let me ask you specific. I mean, is the Great Replacement theory eugenics?
Yeah, I think it is. So the Great Replacement theory was inherent to eugenics as it developed in America in the 1910s and 20s, and it's sort of like the fall of Rome declinism as well. It's the idea that either deliberately engineered by, well, in the original version, it's by the Jews, but it's just the idea that the existing, not indigenous, the existing population is being replaced because they're not having enough children, they're too decadent, but being replaced by invaders.
Who are more pliable to these secret forces.
Yes, yes, engineered by, I mean, it depends how deep in the conspiracy you want to go. It's either just the Jews or it's the reptiles who are disguising themselves as Jews.
It's an important distinction to make. Yeah.
I mean, there's levels of crazy within this.
But I mean, you sound like you're issuing a cautionary tale that this history that you've written about may have another chapter yet to be written.
Trump is very explicit about being a supporter of Great Replacement theory. Elon Musk is explicit about it. It's the sort of pseudo-philosophical movements that have had some prominence in the last 20 years or so, such as effective altruism and long-termism. A writer whose name I've temporarily forgotten said, find an effective altruist, scratch them, and you'll find a eugenicist under the surface. I don't think it's explicit, but the eugenics ideas are inherent to them, and it is. I mean, it's quite possible that it's going to be policy. In some ways.
Can you envisage that?
I don't know. 3 weeks ago, if you'd asked me that, I'd say no. Don't be ridiculous. But I'm not so sure.
Adam, thank you. We've got some time for questions. Do we have roving mics? I should have asked at the beginning. Or do we just need to shout?
Is the Bengal famine going to be more or less cheery than that?
Well, you've laid down the gauntlet for Kavita tomorrow night. We have roving mics at the back. There's a question here, gentleman in the front row.
Wait, I have a policy.
Oh, sorry, I forgot your policy.
In 2015, a scientific paper was published which shows that if women ask questions first in question and answer sessions, then women ask more questions. But if men ask questions first, then women don't.
So for scientific reasons, can we have a question from... Here we are. There's a lady behind you.
OK, thanks. That was really interesting. But can I ask a frivolous question? Have you told Natalie Haynes about the eye colour thing?
Have I done what?
Natalie Haynes' Miss Marple tribute kind of relies on the eye colour rule.
Oh, yeah, do you know what?
I remember when I read it, you'd had just written something about how this eye colour thing is.
So,
And then they just repeated it on
just to
Radio
explain,
4, so I've just been reminded of it.
No, Nat did ask me about this. So just to explain, Natalie Haynes, a brilliant writer, comedian, and classicist, and someone that we both
Without
know.
being a eugenicist.
It
can be done.
It is possible to be a classicist and not be a eugenicist. I can name a few classicists today who definitely are.
Don't.
No. Buy me a drink. Nat, I help her out with a lot of her works in terms of the biology, but she did ask me about the eye colour inheritance pattern because it's crucial to the solving of her. And I advise on some cultural projects, and mostly I go, yeah, it's fine.
It's a good story.
Yeah.
It's a very good
And look, if Nat wrote it, it's fine.
Thank you very much. We still have the gentleman at the front who has to get a mic to the front. That would be wonderful. Thank you very much.
You were right. It's quite depressing, but thank you very much. Fascinating as well. It's a question about Galton and how sincere his thinking was. You say he was quite systematic in the way he collected data, and his cousin, Charles Darwin, who did a lot of systematic work, came out with The Origin of Species, and yet, despite it contradicting his faith, he still published The Origin of Species, and he reconciled that within himself somehow. But did Galton, would he have understood what he was doing? Was he being genuine and sincere about his conclusions, or did he know all along that he was really misleading?
Interesting question.
It's a great question, and I think the answer is I think he thought he was right. I don't think he was being disingenuous for political reasons. I think Galton was an ultra-systemizer. So that whole thing about him, when you can count, he was obsessed with trying to put metrics on things which until that point in history had been nebulous or esoteric. So some of his other...
And he's part of a Victorian movement of hyperclassification.
Absolutely. Right, really into that. We must name everything, which I've got a whole set of different problems with that. He tried to create a beauty map of Britain by measuring the absolute dimensions of people's faces, of women's faces, in order to establish who were the most attractive.
Dundee was the least attractive,
Aberdeen.
wasn't it? Aberdeen, all right. I've never been to Aberdeen, so I can't judge Galton on that. But
and an amazing example of what he was like as a man is that before he did that beauty map, which was based in the UK, which said that South Ken were the most attractive women and Aberdeen were the least attractive women. Mm-hmm. He did that using a special glove, which he had manufactured, which had 3 needles on the fingers. He referred to this glove as his pricker. And he had a piece of paper in his pocket with 3 spaces for the 3 categorizations of female beauty, which were attractive, indifferent, or prize sow, right? And the reason he did this in his pocket, so he went around Britain with his gloved pricker in his hand, staring at women and rating them. Right? The reason he did that as a methodology is because he started this project in Vichy in France, where he did it with just a notebook. And he discovered that if you stare at women in public spaces and then tick a box which says prize sow on it, then your data is very quickly going to be interpreted by their husbands or indeed the women themselves. And he realized he couldn't generate a data set. So instead of thinking, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, he thought, I know, I'll do it secretly. And so I think it's another example of how his social interactions and his ability to recognize, I think it's very difficult to posthumously diagnose people, and with nebulous definitions such as autism, I think one must be extremely cautious about it. But with his ultra-systemizing brain, his complete inability to recognize what people are actually like and interact with other humans, I think it seems likely that he was unusual and had autistic sensibilities, which is I don't say in any way to cast aspersions or judge people who are autistic or have autism. But it just manifested in a very particular way with him. He was anti-religious as well. He was at a time when religiosity, Christianity in Britain was being challenged in many different directions, including through Darwin's work. Galton thought that one of the worst sins of the church was that it prevented the greatest men in history from having children because they were scholars who were in the church and therefore were celibate. And he thought this was why the dominance of the church in the Middle Ages had resulted in intellectual stagnation. He did another sort of semi-amusing experiment, was that he challenged the efficacy of prayer statistically by working out who are the people who are most prayed for. And the answer is kings and queens. Because every day, millions of Britons would pray for the health of the monarch in daily prayers. And that had been happening for hundreds of years. So he calculated the mortality rates in royal families compared to people who weren't prayed for at the same rate and determined that their mortality rates were higher. They died younger than people who were prayed for less. So his brain is going, like, how can I work out the mathematical solution to this cultural problem? And those two examples are trivial and one of them's absolutely horrible. But it's exactly the same mindset which goes, we have geniuses in families that runs through the male line of families. Why does it occur? And he comes up with completely the wrong answer because of his cultural background, because of his privilege.
Which he doesn't recognise.
Which he doesn't see.
Mm.
But given that he's...
I think we need to try and get...
Sorry, that was a long answer
couple
to a
more
good
questions
question.
in, because we're at risk of overrunning. There's a gentleman there at the back.
Thank you very much. I feel in need of a counter-narrative. And I wonder, Adam, if you'd be able to encapsulate with the same kind of clarity that you've encapsulated as it were, the negative narrative. I wonder if you could encapsulate a biologically plausible, given that there's biology underneath this, right? Biologically plausible counter-narrative that you would like to replace what you've been talking about tonight. Because it's one thing to, denigrate a particular sort of thread of history, but it just feels to me like we need a counter-narrative to balance that.
I don't understand.
I mean, in other words, okay, well, let me say, given the reality of genetics and inheritance, how would you see that playing out? How would you see a narrative of us using that in an equitable social space where actually we could understand it differently? One of the reasons I ask is because genetics, for the reasons you've discussed, has such a bad name in the non-scientific public, essentially.
Genetics does?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, the evidence doesn't say that. So the evidence...
But put that aside, is there a kind of a narrative that you would like to have around inheritance and, the genetic basis of a lot of our biology?
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, that is a complex question. I'm not fully sure I understand it, but let me have a back. The first thing to say is that the public understanding and public trust in genetics specifically is at an all-time high, and that is the vast majority of people, and this increased during COVID. So I was an author on a paper where we demonstrated that. So that's the first thing. So trust in science is an all-time high. Trust in genetics is at a higher level than trust in science in general. So that's a good news story. The second thing worth saying, and I think this is in reference to what you're alluding to, is that I'm not a blank slatist at all. Genetics is incredibly important. And it is in the complex interactions between genetics and environments that we see the emergence of behaviours. Everything is heritable, everything has a genetic component, everything has an environmental component too. So I think, I don't know, maybe the counter-narrative that I'm really interested in spreading in terms of the public understanding of genetics is specifically to move away from the biological determinism that is characterized by the monogenic Mendelian determinism that was inherent both to the eugenics movement in the States, but also is totally embedded in culture today. Most people in this country and most people in the world do not learn any genetics or pay attention to any genetics after the age of 16, right? And what they are left with, based on the syllabus, is a monogenic, deterministic, Mendelian, ultra-Mendelian version of genetics, which is biologically simplistic to the point of being wrong. It is in service of the eugenicists, of the American eugenicists of the 1910s. It actually, side point, it gets Mendel really wrong, which just pisses me off. And the emerging evidence is also that it nurtures a more biologically essentialist view of race, specifically about IQ. So the way we teach genetics to school-age children makes scientifically illiterate, eugenics-serving Mendelian idiots. I know, don't use the word idiots, that was literally a eugenics term. Mendelianly ignorant, more racist people. So I think maybe in answer to your interesting question is that the counter-narrative is a better understanding of genetics. It's super important. It is the fundamental biological science, and it's complex. The reason that people like me are still employed is because we know almost nothing about genetics. And I think we've gone through this cycle that starts with Darwin in 1859, and then Mendel, and then into the modern synthesis era where those two things are fused, and then in 53 with DNA. I'm gesticulating to Matthew Cobb there, who's written one of the great biographies of Francis Crick, coming out later this year. And then the Human Genome Project. And every single step of the way, we think we've landed on a thing which solves the problem of genetics and answers the questions of genetics, when actually each step of the way just makes it clear how little we don't know. The classic Donald Rumsfeld quote, which I think is, it's clumsy, but it's very wise, that we're trying to turn known unknowns, what was it? It's so ugly that I can't remember it. There are known knowns and there are unknown unknowns.
I can't remember.
And then he goes, what we're trying to do is we're trying to convert unknown unknowns into known unknowns. And that's what science is. But it wasn't until the 21st century that we had mapped out what we didn't yet know. And this is great for biology, because now we know the questions that we needed to ask.
But the confidence of not knowing those unknowns were there allowed for Galton and eugenics.
Yeah, absolutely. So my advocacy is for better science education, for better understanding of genetics. Why would anyone think that things as beautiful and as complex as humans could be explained in the way that the 20th century tried to explain them, and the way that Galton explained them?
That's a beautiful answer. Do we have time, or are we over? We finished?
One more.
Couple more?
There's a woman there who's had her hand up for a while.
Can we get a microphone to this lady here, please, in the middle? Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Actually, where you ended was perfect in terms of the complexity of humans. You touched on how eugenics is bad science in many ways, because it is premised on finding solutions, and then the premise on good and bad traits to cultivate in humans. But you also touched on how it's a natural extrapolation from selective breeding and cultivation of crops and animals. And I guess, and I do mean this sincerely, I'm not playing devil's advocate, I suppose, how do you then, are you implying that is not real science either, or other than just open speciesism, I suppose? Is it just to you that humans are different?
This is a great question, and I'll try and be as brief as I can. In the book, I frame it around a tweet that Richard Dawkins put out a few years ago, in which he said, of course eugenics would work. It works for cows and pigs and roses. And he goes on to say, and I want to be absolutely clear about this, he goes on to say that he doesn't endorse it at all. But I thought that was an interesting question to ask. I mean, you get over the question of what works actually means. But I think it doesn't work in the same way for humans as it does for agriculture. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that agriculture, plants and animals are bred to exist in very, very controlled environments, right? And they're bred to have very specific traits which flourish in those controlled environments. So you take none of the animals that exist in our farms for the last 10,000 years or so are very closely related to wild animals. If you take a bunch of, you take a Frisian cow with its ridiculous udders and release it into the wild, it's going to survive for a matter of hours or days. Farmers have known the problems with eugenics for forever, because farms aren't really like old MacDonald's, sweet romantic version of frolicking cows. They're incredibly brutal places where animals are bred, and they're bred generation to generation to maximize specific traits because we want to eat them or wear jumpers made from them. But as a result of that, you end up with very unhealthy animals. Now, farmers know this because they have to backbreed in genetic diversity, so you don't end up with animals, with flocks or herds that simply die. The rose is a really good example. What a beautiful thing that has been bred over thousands of years and generations in order to be this thing that we consider to have great aesthetic value. But what a fragile thing it is. It can only grow in certain environments with the care and attention of a rose gardener. Now, humans are not anything like that. We exist in all sorts of environments. It would work for humans, but only if we were willing to make very brutal sacrifices in terms of killing humans that weren't working out during eugenics programs, or if we radically reduce the lives that we live, so we only exist in monocultures. Agriculture and human existence are very, very different categories to each other. All that tweet says is that we're evolved, and that's the beginning and the end and the sophistication of that argument. It doesn't address any of the issues of what farming actually is and what evolution and artificial selection actually is. And, I did something radical when I was researching the book, which is I spoke to farmers. And I think all of the people in the history of eugenics who've used farming as an analogy never spoke to farmers.
We've probably got time for one more question. There's a gentleman here in the third row. Can we get a microphone down here, please? Thank you very much. On its way to you, sir.
Thank you. Really, really interesting talk. You got into the politics of scientific discrimination, and you focus a lot on America, Donald Trump, Elon Musk, which I think is obviously very accurate if you follow the news at all. But I also think looking around the UK, there's a lot of very troubling trends occurring. You've seen people like Suella Braverman talking about, well, I'm not really English because I come from a ethnic minority heritage, the sort of discrimination we see against Muslims and South Asian communities, and even the sort of policies that came out just in the last few days from the Labour government in terms of cutting benefits for those who can't work and those who are, have disabilities like that. What sort of future seems possible in the UK specifically? Because as a Black British person, it's very concerning to end on a depressing note.
That's a question for you.
Well, I think it's very different from eugenics, but I do sense an idea that the biological nature of ethnic identities, and some ethnicity is just a word we use instead of race because we're uncomfortable with race, that idea that you need to be of a certain biology to qualify for certain titles. That idea, I think, is in the ascendancy. I mean, this question about Englishness as opposed to Britishness, I think it's a question that's being deliberately provoked, deliberately used as a tool. But the fact that it's a legitimate, that it's an effective tool, that politicians think this is a debate that I can benefit from, I'm not sure that was the case 5 years ago. 10 years ago. The research done by the organisation British Futures, what it showed was that the view that non-white people can't be English is higher among non-white communities themselves than it is among white people. That non-white people believe Englishness is not an identity open to them at a higher rate than white people would close that identity. So I think it's very telling that there is a sort of self-disqualification from that phrase. I've just actually, it's probably a really dumb idea, given an interview to the Daily Express, which I may live to regret, where I've said the same thing as, I don't feel English, but I don't feel I'm allowed to be English because of the experiences I had growing up. A few years ago, I gave a talk to the England football team, and those young men have the flags and the iconography of English. They're entirely comfortable with it because they don't have the same experience as me. So the difference between that position and what was said by not just Braverman but other politicians is I've got the right to choose or not choose to be English, but I wouldn't impose it on somebody else. It's the idea that because I don't feel this, that this identity is closed to you because you might be like me. That's what I find troubling.
And there is a genetics element to this as well, which is that something that we didn't predict in genetics is that the emergence of genetic ancestry testing, which is it looks like it's slightly on the wane now because it's I think it's had its heyday. I think a lot to do with the fact that you do it once and then go, well, what do I do with this information now? But those sorts of tests have the ability to reinforce a deterministic, genetically encoded identity on people that most sensible people just go, bollocks, that was quite fun. It isn't possible to be 40% Swedish. That isn't a thing that can exist in the world. And yet every week I get people saying, I've just discovered I'm 25%. No, you could be 25% Swedish, actually, yes. But you know what I mean, right? So at the one hand, it is trivial and stupid and scientific baubles for fun, but I think does reinforce a genetic determinism which is related to cultural and historical identity. But at the far end of the spectrum, the far right have been using these tests for years now to supposedly demonstrate their Aryan purity and supremacy.
I think the idea that everyone's using them to discover how Irish they were or whether they're partly Ashkenazi, people are using those tests in the hope that it demonstrates something that fits into their ideology.
Exactly, their pre-existing narrative. Or I frequently get people saying, I've just discovered I'm 38% Spanish, which explains my temperament. Or I'm 73% German, which explains my sock drawer. And you just go, well, all of these absurd stereotypes that, again, the serious point is they rely on a version of hereditarianism, which is, it's all nature, it's all encoded. The reason I'm the way I am is because of my ancestors. And the fact of the matter is that you don't even share half of your DNA with your actual ancestors 10 generations ago. So all your ancestors 10 generations ago, you only carry DNA from about half of them. So you are descended from these people and you have no genetic relationship to them. Genetics is super important, but it is not deterministic. It is not the thing that defines who you are. And all of those narratives that say that science will do that, they come straight out of the same playbook.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in thanking Adam Rutherford.